My guest at this time is Joseph Dagnes. He is the co-author of Signing Their Lives Away, The Fame and Misfortune of the Men Who Signed the Declaration of Independence. His co-author and wife is Denise Kiernan. This book is fascinating because of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, most Americans can probably only name a handful if they're lucky. So this book takes you through every single one of those 56 signers and tells you a little bit about their story, and you find out very quickly how different so many of these folks were at the Second Continental Congress. And Joseph, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
What was your inspiration, you and Denise, for writing this book?
Well, it's sort of a strange story. It just popped into my head one day, like how many signers of the Declaration of Independence can you name? And I could easily knock off a handful list, but five who everyone knows, from Benjamin Franklin to John Hancock. There are two Adams and Thomas Jefferson. But beyond that, it starts to get a little tricky. And I thought I had the edge on Denise because I grew up in the state of New Jersey, and one of the signers that I had grown up knowing and liking all my life was a man named Francis Hopkinson, who is believed to have been the designer of the first American flag. But this sort of challenge back and forth became this sort of obsession with us, and we knew we had to learn more, and we were surprised how few of them we actually knew.
What I love here is that there's fascinating details about every one of these people, and one of the signers who some folks may know, but he's not a household name, is Benjamin Rush, who pretty much wrote about all of these different people that he worked with at the Second Continental Congress, and that's how you kind of get a feel of these personalities. I don't know if he was just a gossip or he was just a real observant guy.
Yes, he was. And that gossipy nature of his got him into trouble later in life. But he redeemed himself because he was a medical physician in Philadelphia. He was friends with most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He took notes on them. He wrote about them in his journal, and that's how we get a sense of the ones that he liked, the ones that he disliked, the ones who were strange, it had weird protocols or behaviors in Congress. And later in life, Benjamin Rush was chiefly remembered for being the person who single-handedly reunited Thomas Jefferson and John Adams after a many years political split between the two of them. Benjamin Rush wrote to both of them and kind of acted as like a go-between, and sort of got those two men talking again later in life, and they realized how much more they had in common, and that politics had sort of split them apart. But it was, Benjamin Rush who brought them together. But there were tons of these men that we were astonished to find out about. In other words, there's a guy named Elbridge Gerry, who is the signer who single-handedly created gerrymandering,
yes,
which, as you know, is a very hot topic even to this day. This was a politician who, when he left national office, tried to get elected as governor of Massachusetts for many years, and he just kept trying. And one of his techniques was to gerrymander the districts so that they were in his favor. And there are bizarre little character twists. There's one fellow that Benjamin Rush called the objection maker, because he kept objecting to everything. Sort of the parody of a bad TV courtroom, or every time someone didn't like something, he'd say, "I object." So that's how we know so much about these guys, because of Benjamin Rush.
Fascinating story, and he adds so much to the book through his diaries. And another character that I had never heard of, and I'm guessing most people haven't, but played an absolutely critical role in the vote for independence, was a guy named Caesar Rodney from the colony of Delaware. They had 3 delegates. They really wanted every colony to approve this. It obviously would have made a much stronger statement. One was opposed, one was in favor, and Caesar Rodney was homesick. So tell our listeners what happened.
Yes. So Caesar Rodney lives in our history as Delaware's answer to Paul Revere. He gets this note late. I believe it is on. I haven't looked at this in a long time. I believe it was late on July 1st, and he he realizes, like, they're going to vote tomorrow. I need to be on my horse riding this entire night so I can be in Philadelphia tomorrow morning to cast my vote for independence. And this is exactly what he does. He basically does what a 2 days ride in one stormy night. And for many years later, he shows up. So he shows up in the in Independence Hall. Not, of course, it wasn't called Independence Hall back then. He shows up and casts his vote, and now Delaware is solidly in favor of independence. But for many years, people thought that this was a sort of a it was too fanciful a story, that it had to be made up. And then many years later, in the 2000s, we find this letter that Caesar Rodney wrote to his brother, saying that he did this late night ride, and he mentions the storm that he basically rode through with his horse. That was part of a pretty difficult ride to do, 80 plus miles in a single night. But he did it even though he was sick, and he was an elderly man. He was not in the greatest of health. He had skin cancer that had sort of permeated his face. And they had botched his surgery a couple of times, so he actually wore a little veil to cover that side of his face. He was not the greatest physical specimen, but he managed to get the job done when his colony needed him.
One of the other things that's absolutely fascinating when just looking at the profiles of all of these signers is that how young many of them were, and also how well-to-do. You read signer after signer, and you obviously see the theme that many of them came from wealth. But at the same time, that means they had the most to lose. So it's very, very interesting that they were the ones willing to put their necks on the line here.
Yeah, there was a batch of signers, maybe the four signers from South Carolina, who were from wealthy plantation families. The youngest, we think, was a man named Edward Rutledge. He was, and all these guys, like, if you've ever seen the movie version of the play 1776, they are portrayed beautifully because they show up and they are so well dressed. Everyone's just looking at them going like, why do you wear such fanciful clothing? And that's what these guys were like. In fact, Edward Rutledge was described by John Adams in his own personal diary as a peacock. That's what he thought of this man. So when we think of our politicians today as sort of, behaving badly, backstabbing, that sort of kind of like, or glad-handing, that's exactly the way it was in 1776, except that in this case, they knew that they had a job to do, and they were willing to put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line in order to declare for independence.
The John Adams quotes are fun, too, because he pulls no punches, and it seems like his opinions of you, even on things unrelated to the cause of independence, are generally determined by what you think about his vision of independence. So it always seems to be interrelated. Yes,
I mean, he was staunchly for independence and had been for a long time. But he knew that he was an unpopular figure. He even said at one point I am, as Thomas Jefferson recalled many years later, he said, I am unpopular. We have to get a Virginian has to be at the head of this business, meaning I need a Virginian to vote to motion that we declare independence. And they found that in a signer from Virginia named Richard Henry Lee. And then I need a person who is from Virginia, meaning Thomas Jefferson, to write the document in which we declare independence, because he knew if we don't get the Southerners on board, this is never going to happen. No one is going to declare independence based on the word of a grouchy, grumpy New Englander with Puritan leanings, so to speak.
No, that's exactly right. And so you've got the firebrand up north in New England, and the one from Virginia, not the only one from Virginia, but Richard Henry Lee was certainly a firebrand, and he was the one who made the motion, as you said. And then in the middle, you've got Pennsylvania, which has a Quaker element, of course, and so pacifist in general. And then you just had some others in that part of the country and elsewhere who thought independence is a great idea, but it's probably too soon. And so you've got some folks who didn't necessarily love the idea of declaring independence when they did, but they went along with it. Some of them actually abstained from the vote. The one that surprised me the most was Robert Morris, who put so much into the war effort and the independence effort, and he's now got a university named after him and so forth. But ultimately, he skipped the vote because he wasn't comfortable voting for it, but didn't want Pennsylvania to shoot it down.
Right. He actually walked out of the hall so that he was not present. He was absent when the vote was taken, but then he later signed his name to the document. There's another fellow from Pennsylvania that I'll mention briefly because you kind of hinted at it, a guy named John Morton. This is a man who's fairly obscure. He maybe did one amazing thing in his life, which was sign the Declaration of Independence. But when he went back home to his home district, he found that his neighbors were like, "This is the craziest thing in the world. We're gonna break independence from the king. This is insane." And he paid he felt socially ostracized for the remainder of his life. He didn't live very long. And on his deathbed, he literally said to his family, like, "You mark my words, one of these days people will look back and they will realize that this was the greatest thing that I ever did." And that is a very poignant story, and he was ultimately proved correct.
You point out early in the book that some of the urban legends about what happened to the signers are either exaggerated or flat out not true. No one was actually killed by the British, but one of them had sons imprisoned and died, it seems, in British custody. Another one was hiding in caves for a while, and a lot of them at least had their homes raided, if not destroyed. So there was definitely a cost here.
Yes, there was definitely, and the thing is, like, they could not know when they signed their name on that document what was going to happen to them personally when they did it. So from that perspective alone, they deserve our attention and our thanks. But it is true that many of them lost homes or had their homes damaged, but we can't say, looking back, whether their homes were targeted because they signed the Declaration of Independence. And the other thing that most Americans don't realize is that they signed their names to the document, but their names were kept secret until January 1777, when the names were released. And the thing that happened that changed their minds was Washington's fantastic victory crossing the Delaware, and that military victory emboldened them. It was a turning point in that 8-year war. And they said, you know what, we can now go out because it feels as if the tide has turned. And that's when Americans, for the first time, if we can call them that, American colonists first saw who actually signed the Declaration of Independence.
I just love this book so much. And you learn history even apart from the actual founders. For example, the vote was not on July 4th. And except for John Hancock, almost no one signed the Declaration on July 4th, yet that's our holiday.
Yes, and in fact, let me just give you the chronology briefly. Richard Henry Lee, the Virginian I mentioned earlier, motions early in January that they should break with England and declare independence. And as, you know, classic politicians, what they did is exactly what people would do today. Let's postpone the vote for a month while we consider this. Well, great. So we have a month to decide if this is what we need to do, write the document, discuss it, debate it, talk about it, and then the vote is actually July 2nd. July 4th is the day on which they agreed to accept the document that Thomas Jefferson, Adams, and Benjamin Franklin and a couple of others had actually worked on over the course of that month. But they do not sign that document until later that summer on August 2nd. That is when they sign the document that we know and we can see if we go to the National Archives. So even though it's very badly faded, that is the document known as the Engrossed Declaration of Independence. And that was not signed until August 2nd, 1776. So as far as I'm concerned, we should not be celebrating 4th of July on one day. It's a whole summer of independence, and we should be celebrating that every single year because there's something that goes on in June. There's something that goes on in July, and there's something that goes on in August.
I think a lot of folks can get behind that, especially if they can get a few extra days off.
Get the barbecue and the beer out. It'd be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Joseph, thank you to you and Denise for this amazing book. And I should point out there's another one that we may speak to you down the line about, and that's Signing Their Rights Away. That's about the signers of the Constitution. This one is Signing Their Lives Away, the Fame and Misfortune of the Men Who Signed the Declaration of Independence. I promise you will learn a lot, even about the signers you think you already know a lot about. So congratulations on the book, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Joseph Dagnes, the co-author of Signing Their Lives Away, the Fame and Misfortune of the Men Who Signed the Declaration of Independence. I'm Greg Columbus, reporting for Radio America.